Hey everybody, it's Aaron from the South Haven Church of Christ. And so this playlist of classes is me and Scott Ingram, who kind of helped co-teach this class with me when I was traveling, teaching through Daniel, the book of Daniel. When I was going back through and downloading the lessons, I sort of realized that in lesson one, like the first 10, 12 minutes of background information got cut off. So we're going to start off with this. I'm going to splice it together with the video from the first class at South Haven that worked, and we'll go from there. So, all right, this class is on the book of Daniel. And so one of the big questions is, why should we study Daniel? A lot of times people want to study, New Testament books, which of course we should. That's what comprises the law of Christ, Galatians 6:2, that we're under as Christians, right? Which is the gospel. But there's also books in the New Testament that an understanding of the Old Testament helps for us. Romans 15:4, 1 Corinthians 10, both basically have this idea of the things written before time or aforetime are written for our learning. So we can learn things from the Old Testament, even though we're not under the law of Moses, okay? And so the book of Daniel is one of those. When I teach Revelation, I almost always start off with trying to explain how you need to have a knowledge of the Old Testament to properly understand the book of Revelation. And the first place I normally go is Revelation 13. And I show the beast rising up out of the sea, and it's like a lion, a leopard, and a bear. And I say, what is that trying to point out to you? And if you don't know the Old Testament, sometimes you think it's a literal beast or a literal monster or something at the end of time in this big battle of Armageddon, right? Well, if you know the book of Daniel and you know Daniel chapter 7 is a vision that Daniel has about the future and about the coming kingdoms after Babylon. And you have Babylon, you have Persia, Medo-Persia, and you have Greece, and then you have the fourth kingdom, which isn't mentioned, which is Rome historically, but it's not mentioned by name in Daniel. Babylon is mentioned by name in chapter 2. You are the head of gold in that vision. In Daniel chapter 7, you're given the vision, but Daniel 8, and about verses 20 through 21, you've got the mention by name of Persia, Medo-Persia, the Medes and the Persians, which were kind of a joint kingdom. And then you have Greece mentioned by name. So the fourth kingdom that's referenced throughout the book of Daniel is the kingdom of Rome, which historically, guess who's in power at the time of the book of Revelation, who's persecuting the church? Rome. So if you have an understanding of the Old Testament, it really helps when you get to some New Testament books, right? You think about a lot of the people who were the first century Christians, the Jews, were what? Steeped in the Old Testament, right? And the Gentiles who were brought in were probably educated in the Old Testament, obviously. But yeah, so the first century church had a really good understanding of the Old Testament. So it's really important to study Daniel. Daniel is actually the seventh most cited, quoted book in the New Testament. There's about 133 references that one source I looked at cited. It uses a lot of language that's really important in the New Testament. The word "son of man," or the phrase "son of man," which shows up in Ezekiel and Daniel. In Daniel, it references this messianic term. Well, whenever Jesus uses this phrase to describe himself, I believe in Mark 2, 8 through 10, when he reads the Pharisee's mind, that would be a reference to, hey, this is the guy claiming to be the Son of Man from Daniel 7, I believe it is. Or maybe it's 9, Daniel 9. I think that's eluding me right now. But so it helps you to understand some things used in the New Testament, right? It's going to help you understand any apocalyptic book like Revelation, okay? It's going to help you to there's things in it that are really cool prophecy-wise, like the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. It talks about this prophecy of 70 weeks, but 77s is what the text says. And I believe it's referencing 490-year period from the time of Daniel all the way up through the time of the Messiah being cut off, Jesus. So it's a prophecy of Jesus with a very specific timeline. When we get to chapter 9, we'll talk more about that. But there's passages in Luke where it says that the people were waiting. So it's like the people were expecting the Messiah to show up in their lifetime. Well, why? Well, if you knew the prophecy of 70 weeks, you knew 490 years from Daniel's time, you're looking right up to about the time that Jesus would come onto the scene, right? So I think the prophecy of 70 weeks actually starts with the people being sent back. But we'll look at that in more detail when we get to chapter 9. People sent out of Babylon back to their land. It also is good in understanding AD 70. So, we're in 2021 AD, almost 2022, which is crazy to me. I still remember 2000, like the year 2000, like it was yesterday. I was in my friend's basement watching the ball drop with all my friends, and their parents shut the circuit breaker off when it got to zero, and we thought Y2K was a real thing. But that doesn't seem that long ago. But when we say 70 AD, we're talking about 37 years after Jesus died. Okay, if he died in 33 AD, won't get into that right here. But so 70 AD, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman army, right? Well, that's what's being discussed in Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 34, right? But in Matthew 24:15, you have Jesus, who actually, it's ironic, is referencing who wrote Daniel. Jesus is confirming that Daniel was the author. Some critical scholars will say, well, the book is so prophetic, it couldn't be written by Daniel. It had to be written later. So they'll say Daniel couldn't have written it. It had to be written by some second century person, because if they admit Daniel wrote it, then they're basically admitting to inspiration, because they're admitting no person could have predicted all these world history events with such specificity, except somebody who lived after it, right? But anyway, in Matthew 24:15, it says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee the mountains, right? Well, in Daniel, the abomination of desolation is spoken of, okay? In the intertestamental period, which is the time after Malachi and before Matthew, so this 400 silent years, okay, where there was no prophet. The Jews said there was no prophet after Malachi, until John the Baptist comes on the scene. In that period, there was something called the Maccabean Revolt. A guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid Syrian king. He came through Jerusalem on his way back from Egypt. He had went down to Egypt to the Ptolemies to threaten them, and Rome, who was a rising power, met him and drew a line, a circle in the sand around him, and told him that he needed to make his decision before he stepped out of that circle that they had drawn around him, and that he was going to retreat. And so he did, and he retreated back up towards Syria. And when he went through Jerusalem, he decimated Jerusalem. And one of the things he did was he slew a pig in the temple in the altar. And so that was the abomination of desolation. So whenever you have Matthew 24:15 referencing that, it's likely a reference to what the Roman armies did, something very similar in AD 70 when they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. So there's things like this that understanding the Old Testament helps you understand things you read about in the New Testament much better. Also, it comes really down to a practical application, right? Why Daniel is such a good book to study. It's about a book about a man living in exile, right? I mean, the Bible says we are exiles and strangers on earth. So our home is heaven, right? So as culture becomes more hostile to Christianity, which in America in 2021, it's still more of a verbal thing. Maybe some businesses, maybe you get sued, or maybe someone tries to crack down on you. But the more that we're going to feel persecution if America continues to become more hostile to Christianity, and the more that happens, the more practical a book like Daniel really is. Sometimes these stories are relegated to children's stories and never studied again. Oh yeah, the three guys in the fire, and they went in, they came out, and they weren't hurt, and Daniel was throwing a lion's den, and the next day he was still alive, right? But we need to study these stories as adults, because they're really a lot of practical application to us. And I know that some of these lessons are viewed by people all over the world. I know a lot of my friends in India and Africa, in the Middle East, will see these. And I know some of the places where you all are, you're experiencing persecution, in some places much worse than others. But this book should be helpful and encouraging to you to see people like Daniel and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, who their Babylonian slave names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael thrown into the fiery furnace. And when they say to Nebuchadnezzar, look, we don't really have to answer you in this. Like, if our God saves us, great. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to your idol, right? Examples of courage in men like that. Or Daniel saying, the government can tell me whatever they want. I'm still going to pray to God. That's my first and foremost responsibility. Like Acts 5:29, we shall obey God rather than men, right? So whenever the government tells you to do something that's illegal or it causes you to break God's law, you say, sorry, I'm going to obey God rather than men. And that's what Daniel did in Daniel chapter 6. He was thrown into the lion's den, and he was preserved by God, right? Now, if we go through some persecution like that today, God may not save us like that. But at the same time, you know that those men in Daniel chapter 3, even if God doesn't save you, then you're still going to be protected and dying faithfully. Revelation 2:10, be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. Also, the author, Daniel is the author. I have more notes on this. I have more on this in the notes. But the book is written, from Daniel's perspective. There are some chapters like 4 where it's written from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. It's really a letter. It's a summary of a letter. But in Daniel, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 2, Daniel spoke saying, I saw in my vision by night. So as you go through the book, you'll see that that Daniel attributes it to himself. And in Matthew 24:15, Jesus attributed to it. He is mentioned in third person in the first 6 chapters, but remember, it's guided by the Holy Spirit. So that is pretty much where the first lesson, where the audio picks up. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. I'm going to connect this video with it, and you should flow seamlessly into the rest of the background material that I provided in class. All right. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you guys enjoyed the lessons. Do you have any questions? Just let me know.
That you always think about the question, if you could sit down and talk with a Bible character, Daniel would be at least in my top 5, maybe my top 3, because you have a guy who likely is taken into captivity at the age of 15, and he's put under the chief of the what? Eunuchs. So you have a 15-year-old boy, 15, 16, 17, taken into Babylon, which is like the cultural center of the world. I mean, imagine taking a 15-year-old to LA or to New York City, right? And he's supposed to serve the king of the whole world at this time. Do you think there'd be some temptations to his faith? You better believe it, right? As a no one, you don't know anybody. Your parents aren't there. You're a 15, 16-year-old in New York or LA. You're being, you're under servant of like the world's leader. And yet from the time he's 15 till the time he's about probably 80 to 85, he goes all the way through Babylon, all the way through Persia. And from what we see in Scripture, he's pretty solid as far as, you have some Bible characters that will have these big instances. They're fairly faithful and they have these big instances. We don't seem to see that with Daniel. All right, so Daniel's a great character. In Ezekiel 28, the prince of Tyre is mocked, sort of sarcasm, says, you're wiser than Daniel, right? So that's implying that Daniel is what? A wise man, that's right. He's alluded to in Hebrews 11, 33 and 34, the Hall of Fame of Faith, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions, right? That's likely probably a reference to Daniel. Let's look at the date of writing. About 530, okay? So I know sometimes the dates are more interesting to others, but 606 is likely the first time, the first deportation. How many different deportations did Babylon take of people from Judah and in Jerusalem over into Babylon? How many different ones? There was 3. The first one was in 606, then 596, then 586. And then Persia took over in 539, I think that's right. And then in 539, you've got Daniel, who still is up there under 2 world leaders, right? So now he was serving the king of Babylon, now he's serving the king of Persia, and he's likely writing this at some point after that. Now, there's a lot of, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's a lot of, you may hear the term liberal critical scholar, okay? Scholar's a relative word. I guess so is liberal and critical. But what you'll have is you'll have people that say Daniel didn't write the book, okay? Here's some reasons why. They normally don't believe in the miraculous inspiration of the Bible, right? So think about the book of Daniel. Think about all the prophecy in it. What's the problem if Daniel wrote it in the 6th century BC? It's miraculous knowledge, right? So normally what they'll say is they will look in the later chapters, and even in Daniel 7, you have a vision of the world kingdoms. You've got Babylon, Persia, Greece with Alexander the Great, then Rome. And then in the Grecian, before Rome, Greece, Alexander's kingdom was split to 4 different generals. You start reading about them in Daniel 10 through 12 called the king of the north and the king of the south. King of the north is normally the Seleucid kings from Syria. The kings of the south are Ptolemies from Egypt, right? And so the book in Daniel 10 through 12 says the king of the north will move against the king of the south, but the king of the south will it's literally like reading a history book, right? But it's written 300 years before it ever happens. So if you're a liberal critical scholar, Daniel can't write the book because if he did, then what? Daniel was predicting the future, right? So they'll say, actually, this history is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, 150 BC. Therefore, that's when the book had to be written, right? There's a lot of different pieces of evidence to prove that's not right, but here's the biggest one. Remember something called the LXX? It's the Greek, the Septuagint. You remember that term? You guys remember what the Septuagint is? It's the Hebrew Old Testament translated into what? Greek, right? And it was done about 250 BC, okay? So do you know what the problem with that view is? Guess what the book of Daniel's in? It's in the Septuagint, which means 100 years before all these events. So even if you wanted to be super generous and say, I won't say Daniel wrote it in 600, I'll say another Jewish person acting like Daniel wrote it in 250, you still have prophetic events 100 years before they ever happen, right? So obviously that shows inspiration, which is why I have no problem with Daniel writing it, okay? So Daniel wrote it about 530 BC, just enough time to have established himself in Persia, all right? The date of events, 606 BC. That's when the first deportation would have been, down through about 536. So it covers Daniel's life from a teenager all the way down until the time that Daniel's probably about 80 years old. Now, Ezekiel is a similar time. Ezekiel is a captive. He's taken in, I think, the second deportation, and he's over by the river Kibar. So I want to talk about the world stage. I've got a little bit PowerPoint. All right, so we already discussed this. Well, no, we got a couple more. So author, Daniel, date of events, 606 to 536. World power has shifted from Assyria to Babylon, okay? We're going to go ahead and look here at a couple maps, talk about a little bit of Bible history, okay? But before Babylon, who's the world power? Who took the northern kingdom? Assyria, right? If you read through 2 Kings 1 through about 15, you're going to read a lot about Pul and Shalmaneser and some of the other names that I can't normally pronounce properly, of the Assyrian kings, right? And Assyria is going to fall, and Babylon is going to take that world power. When we look at the book, there's going to be 6 great stories. Now, you could probably add, some of these people we'll split the visions up and say, well, I think it's 7 visions. That's fine. You can count however you want. But there's great stories like the king's food in chapter 1. We're going to cover that maybe today. The king's dream of a statue in chapter 2. The fiery furnace. The king's dream of a tree in chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar is seen as this giant tree that's cut down. In chapter 5, we're going to see the writing on the wall, the mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, which means you've been weighed in the balances, okay? We'll get that in chapter 5. Daniel in the lion's den, okay? We're going to look at that from an adult perspective, not just, the kids' story. 5 great visions. You've got the vision of the 4 beasts in chapter 7, the 4 world kingdoms. The vision of the Ancient of Days coming to the Son of Man, which we talked about a little bit in the life of Christ, which seems to be a vision that may be happening after the ascension, right? We'll talk about the goat and the ram, which is talking about Medo-Persia and Greece fighting in world history. We'll talk about the 70 weeks prophecy, and then chapters 10 through 12 of the future of God's people. This last one, I want us to look at some verses. The book is not fully chronological, all right? What do I mean by that? Well, let's just look at it. Chapters 1 through 4 seem to be in order. They're under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Go to chapter 5 and verse 30 and 31. Daniel chapter 5. So let's say you're just reading through Daniel for the very first time, and you're reading chronologically. Somebody read Daniel chapter 5, verses 30 and 31. Okay, so Belshazzar, who's the king of the Chaldeans, king of the Babylonians, okay? Likely Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, okay? He is killed, and Darius the Mede receives the kingdom. So the Medo-Persians take over, right? Now, that's Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar, just what happens to him? He's killed, right? Go to Daniel 7:1. I remember the first time I read this book, like just straight through without any commentaries or anything. This confused me so much. I remember flipping back and forth thinking, is there two guys named? But look at Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1. In the first year of who? Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions in his head while on his bed. Wait a minute, didn't he just die in chapter 5? And now in chapter 7, okay? Go to 8. Go to 8:1. 8:1 says, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. So chapter 8, he says it's in Belshazzar's third year. Chapter 7, it's Belshazzar's first year. And then if you go in chapter 5, remember you had Darius that took over. Well, chapter 9 and verse 1 says during the first year of Darius, right? So the truth of it is that the book doesn't seem to be in chronological order, okay? If you were going to read it in chronological order, there's lots of different people's chronologies. But let me just give you at least the one I think for now is going to suffice. That's probably the order we'll go through the book. We probably will hop around just to go through it chronologically. Okay, chapters 1 through 4 are in order, okay? Then you've got the next king, Belshazzar. So Daniel chapter 7 says in the first year of the king of Belshazzar. So 1 through 4, 7. Then 8 says in Belshazzar's third year. Then you'd probably hop back to chapter 5 where Belshazzar is killed and it's conquered. After that, you'd probably go to Daniel 9, which says the first year of Darius. And then Daniel 11 says also in the first year of Darius the Mede, right? And then Daniel 6. So you'd probably go 1 through 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 10 through 12 maybe. So it can be a little confusing, right? So we're going to go through it much slower as we go through in the class. Like I said, I'll give you my notes if you want to kind of go through those. Some of it depends too. There's a lot of arguments between different people who write commentaries. Some of them think there are multiple Dariuses. They don't think that this Darius is the same as this one. Others think that they do. I'll recommend 2 books if you like to order extra books. Rex Turner wrote this book, Daniel, a Prophet of God. It's a really great read. It's pretty high level. Well, let me take that back. It's in depth. It's not high level. It's not like you can't understand. It's just really in depth. A lot of reading. This is another book that is actually my favorite on Daniel. It's actually written by Drew Leonard, who's actually a friend of mine. Exposition of Daniel. If you guys know Drew, he's very intelligent. He's almost got. I always ask him if he has a photographic memory because the way he remembers stuff in like Isaiah, Jeremiah, is the way I remember like Acts too, right? So he's very smart. He's done a lot of research, a lot of reading from a lot of different scholars, and then combines a lot of their views in this one. So it's called Exposition of Daniel. If you want to take a look at it after class, let me know. But that's a really great one with a lot of world history. So what's the reason for it being out of chronology? There's one possible reason. If you look at the book in the original language, now I can't read Hebrew or Aramaic, so that's not what I mean. But I mean, in chapter 1 through chapter 2 and verse 4, it's in Hebrew. And then in verse 4 of chapter 2, it switches, and it's in Aramaic from chapter 2, verse 4, all the way through chapter 7 and verse 28. And then chapter 8, it switches back, 8 through 12, to Hebrew. Aramaic was in the 8th century. It was like the Assyrian second language. And then by the 6th and 7th centuries, it basically became like the official common language of the Middle East. So that was like how Greek didn't actually take over. It took over Aramaic whenever the Grecian kingdom came in, right? But Aramaic was the common language until Greek displaced it. So it's possible that chapters 2 through 7 deal with a lot more of the world events, whereas chapter 1 through 2, 4, and 8 through 10, 7 through 10, 12 are dealing more with like Hebrew history. So that's one of the possible reasons, right? Okay, so I want to do a little bit of background on the captivity story, okay? The background leading up to the captivity. I want to show you some maps, maybe. We'll get there. There we go. Okay, so these are our kings that we're looking at, okay? So this is, of course, there's lots of kings before this, right? But we're going to look at Hezekiah, okay? Do you guys remember much of the story of Hezekiah? What nation came up against Judah when Hezekiah was king? Before Babylon. Starts with an A. Assyria. You remember Assyria in 2 Kings 18 and 19? The Rabshakeh came up and threatened. It was Sennacherib's army. And the angel in one night killed how many people? 185,000 people, right? So that's during the time of Hezekiah being king, okay? Something else that happened during the time of Hezekiah, which I don't know if you remember this story, but do you remember in Hezekiah's day, he was sick, and somebody sent an envoy to come and bring him gifts and basically letters and check on him. Do you remember what nation that was? They weren't, that's right, Babylon. They weren't the world power yet, right? But let's see if I got a map here. Okay, so this is a map of Sennacherib, okay? This is in where 185,000 people were killed in one night. This is where Nineveh is, okay? Babylon's down here. This is the Euphrates River, and this is the Tigris, okay? So the cradle of civilization, where was Eden? Maybe somewhere down around there, okay? So this is where Abraham came up from. So you go all the way up here. Nineveh, this is where Sennacherib, they came over through Haran. Remember where Haran was? In the Old Testament? Who went here? Abraham, okay. So this is Carchemish. This is a big important city in history because this is actually the battle where Egypt fought against Assyria, and this is where Josiah, we'll talk about that, I'm getting ahead of myself, but so Carchemish, that's a big city, okay? So this is how you had to get, this is all what over here? Desert. So when you want to come from Nineveh and Assyria, Sennacherib came over here, down through, he came through basically wiping out everybody in his path until he got down here to Jerusalem, and that's where the angel of the Lord wiped out 185,000 people. All right, so Hezekiah is king, and he's sick, and envoys come from Babylon, right? This is the Euphrates River, okay? Up here, this is where Nineveh was. So envoys come from Babylon, and they come all the way up over here, and they come down to check on Hezekiah in Jerusalem. And you remember what Hezekiah does? Something really dumb. Yes. He says, wow, thanks for coming to check on me. Hey, by the way, can I show you the temple and all of our wealth and all of our gold and all of our riches? Right? Because he's got what? He's got Merodach Baladan, I think was the king of Babylon. He sends all his people, and he feels pretty special, right? So I mean, you can understand, honestly, the guy thinks he's going to, well, look, let me show you how much God's blessed us, right? He wants them to respect him as a king, so he decides to show them everything. And you remember what Isaiah says is going to happen? That's right. In 2 Kings 20, verses 12 through 18, at that time Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and presents to Hezekiah, for he heard Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah was attentive to him, and showed them all the house of his treasures, the silver, the gold, the spices and precious ointment, all of his armory, everything found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house or his dominion that he'd not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and said, what did these men say, and from where did they come? So Hezekiah said, they came from a far country, from Babylon. And he said, what have they seen in your house? So Hezekiah answered, they've seen all that is in my house. There's nothing among my treasure that I did not show them. And then Isaiah basically says what? One day they're going to come, and they're going to take all of that stuff, right? So then he says, it's not going to happen in your lifetime. And Hezekiah says, oh, great, thanks. You know? He's kind of like, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Okay, it's actually going to be about 150 years after this, whenever this happens, okay? So Hezekiah lives. Hezekiah dies. And then after that, who reigns? Manasseh, right? What do you remember about Manasseh? He's one of the most wicked kings. 2 Kings 21:6, he actually made his son pass through the fire. He literally sacrificed his own son to one of these false gods. Now, I have a hunch. Manasseh's here, right? Now, one of Manasseh's sons was who? Josiah. You remember what Josiah did when he became king? He ended all that. He went through wiping out all the idols, all the different altars. He tore everything down. I mean, is it possible that he saw his brother get passed through the fire? I mean, what would you think about that if you saw your little brother or your older brother get passed through the fire, right? Okay, so Manasseh was a super, super evil, wicked king. In fact, 2 Kings 21:9 says he did more evil than all the Canaanite nations. God said he was going to destroy Jerusalem because of all the innocent blood that Manasseh had shed. Now, 2 Chronicles 33 does say that Manasseh repented. We don't know much of the details about that. But God actually says that Manasseh was so evil, I'm going to destroy Jerusalem no matter what anybody else after him does. How bad of a king would he have to be for God to say, I don't care how good anyone does after him, even like Josiah, God still said he's going to do what? He's going to punish them how evil they were, okay? So Manasseh lives, Manasseh dies. Ammon rules, then Josiah. Josiah is the one that found the book of the law, restores worship, okay? And then after Josiah, he's actually going to die in battle with, let's see the next map. Okay, so Josiah is going to die in a battle with Pharaoh Necho from Egypt, okay? So Egypt is where? Down here, okay? And so Egypt, I'm going to try to summarize as much as I can, but so Assyria is a world power that's weakening, and Assyria goes over here to Carchemish, and this is where the battle is. And Egypt thinks, well, I'm going to go up there and help Assyria and clean up and plunder all these people that are killed, right? Well, Josiah, the one thing that Josiah seems to not do is he's told, don't go up, and what does he do? He goes up from Jerusalem, and he tries to stop Pharaoh Necho from going up here. And here in the Valley of Megiddo, you know, in Revelation, the Armageddon, right? It's actually Harmageddon, which means the mount or valley of Megiddo. So this right here is what this valley where all these battles happen. That's what Revelation's referencing. It's not saying there's going to be an actual battle of Armageddon. It's saying in this region, which represents war, because there were so many battles and wars in this area, that's what that's referencing in Revelation. So Pharaoh Necho goes up, Josiah goes up from Jerusalem, fights with him here in Josiah. What happens to Josiah? He dies. That's right. In Pharaoh Necho even says, hey, God sent me up, leave me alone. And he still tried to fight him, and he ends up dying. Okay? And so at this point in time, you've got this battle, Egypt, Assyria, and this is actually when Babylon sort of starts to take power, okay? I'm afraid I'm going to get into too much history and put you all to sleep. It's 9:30. So Josiah dies, Jehoahaz is made king, and then Pharaoh Necho actually goes back and says, no, you're not going to be king. And he makes someone named Eliakim king and changes his name to Jehoiakim, okay? You can have my notes. Jehoiakim is actually the king who ends up being the king about the time Nebuchadnezzar comes into power. Now, okay, let's see if I got another map or not. No, okay. Thank you for coming. Let's go back. Can you go back to my PowerPoint? Go back to the last map that we have. That's perfect. Okay. So Assyria is the world power, all right? About 625, one of the last great Assyrian kings dies, right? And so whenever the last great Assyrian king dies, then Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, says, we're going to rebel. So about 625 BC, give or take a few years, okay? You have Nebuchadnezzar's dad that raises up and says he's rebelling against Assyria, right? And so they go up, Nebuchadnezzar, his son, who was a war general, obviously before he's a king, gets sent up, and he fights here at Carchemish, and this is where Babylon actually defeats Assyria and defeats Egypt. And in 2 Kings 24, about verse 7, it says, after this, Egypt, they didn't come out of their city anymore. They didn't come to fight anybody. They stayed down here. So after Nebuchadnezzar comes up here and he goes and defeats at Carchemish, that allows him to come right down this route to where? To Jerusalem. And so about 605, 606 BC, that's whenever Nebuchadnezzar comes down through Palestine. He goes to Jerusalem and he takes away the best of the best. He takes away the ones like Daniel and his 3 friends, right? And so that's the first deportation in 606. After that, you've got Jehoiakim will serve him for about 3 years, and then he rebels. Now, 2 Chronicles, maybe 36, says he ruled for 11 years. So Nebuchadnezzar seems to actually have kind of forgiven him for rebelling. I don't know if he said, please, I'm sorry. But he ends up ruling for 11 years. He dies. Right about the time he dies, Another king, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I have a list of kings here. Um, Josiah, okay, Jehoahaz is deposed. Jehoiakim, about 11 years, he dies, and around this time, Jehoiachin actually becomes king for 3 months, and Second Chronicles says he was 8 years old. So Nebuchadnezzar actually comes back in 596, takes him as an 8-year-old, takes him to Babylon, okay? And he's actually released by Nebuchadnezzar's son like 40-some years later when he's in his mid-40s. 37 years later, he's in his mid-40s. So Jehoiachin is deposed, and Zedekiah is made king. Zedekiah rebelled like every king did. You think these guys would get the message, right? Your dad rebels, and what happens? He gets put in fetters, taken to Babylon, punished, and then somehow you think you're going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. So Zedekiah rebelled. Do you remember what happened to Zedekiah? He had 70 sons. Does that ring a bell? He had 70 sons. Do you remember Nebuchadnezzar? Do you remember? Nebuchadnezzar's an interesting guy because in world history, like culturally, he always tried to assimilate and bring different cultures to make Babylon a really like culturally diverse nation. But he's also kind of crazy at times. Zedekiah had 70 sons. Do you remember what Nebuchadnezzar did to all 70 of his kids? He killed them in front of his eyes and then put out Zedekiah's eyes. So the last thing he would ever remember was him killing his 70 sons, right? And then he took him captive in 586, 587. And that is whenever the third deportation, and it's whenever basically Jerusalem was absolutely, utterly destroyed. That's what Jeremiah is writing about in Lamentations. Lamentations means what? Lament. It's sad. It's a weeping. I think it's maybe 5 songs of weeping over the city of Jerusalem, right? So that's sort of the background of the Assyrian to Babylonian shift, all of the kings that led up to what we have in the book of Daniel. So if you're asleep, go ahead and wake up. We're going to maybe talk about some stuff you think is more interesting now. Let's go to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. Now, we're going to go through this verse by verse through the book. That's the goal, at least. We'll stop where we need to, and I still think we can get through it. So, all right, let's go ahead and read Daniel chapter 1, and we'll try to get through. No, just read the first paragraph. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, okay, king of Judah. So this is the first king of the 3 deportations, right? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, which would be Bel. World history tells you Bel was the temple he took these things to. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So this is the first deportation in 606, all right? Jehoiakim, he's the king that took the penknife. Remember that? He cut up Jeremiah's scroll, threw it in the fire. Jehoiakim's penknife. Okay. Verse 3. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine that he drank, and 3 years of training for them. So at the end of that time, they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, not Belshazzar the king, but Belteshazzar, okay? To Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. All right, so let's go back and look through some of this. So they come from Babylon. They come from Judah. They're taken into Babylon. And then Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, brought them. Now, if he's put under the master of the eunuchs, what do you think that, unfortunately for those young men, possibly meant? They were made what? Eunuchs, right? A lot of times in antiquity, if you were a king and you had a whole bunch of wives or a harem, You wanted servants that could protect them and be in your palace, but you also didn't want them messing around, right? And so they would make a lot of these men eunuchs, all right, to make them servants, okay? Now, one of the things I want to look at is the names. Verse 6. So they changed their names. Why do you think they changed their names? Any ideas? Okay, teaching them the language. Someone said something. Make them Chaldeans. That's right. They were trying to assimilate these young boys, 15, into the culture at all ways that they could, right? It's interesting if you look at the meaning of the names, all right? So let's look at Daniel first. Remember what Pharaoh did this in the we said it's the second Joseph? Did Joseph have his name changed? Yeah. I think it's in Genesis, let me look at my notes, 41 to 45. Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, right? So Joseph had his name changed when he was taken into Egypt, right? These boys had the same thing happen to them. So Daniel, the name Daniel means God has judged his life, right? God has judged his life. So who is involved in the name of Daniel? God, okay? They changed Daniel's name from Daniel to Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect his life. So they went from God, Yahweh has judged his life, God is his judge, to then changing his name to include his name is now this God, the Bel, which is who Nebuchadnezzar took all that treasure and put it in his temple, right? So literally with Daniel's name, they're changing his name from something that represents God to something that represents the Chaldean, the Babylonian culture, right? Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious, and they changed his name to Shadrach, which means command of Aku, which is another Babylonian god, okay? Mishael, they changed his name, means who is what God is, right? Who is what God is. And they changed his name to Meshach, which is who is what Aku is. So every one of these names, they're taking it from referencing God and putting their false god in, okay? And then Azariah meant Yahweh has helped, and they changed his name to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, which is another god, right? So what you have is these young 15-year-old boys come to Babylon, and they are trying to wipe out every memory of what? Yeah, of their God. And then they're going to spend 3 years in this you better believe that was a secular education, of 3 years in a secular education trying to teach them the language, all the things of the Chaldeans, and yet when these boys go through, they had such a strong faith from what? From before. The faith that was built by the time that they got to be 15 that, I mean, I'm telling you, I can't imagine a more secular education than what they got in Babylon, right? But their education, training them up through 15 was so strong that what happened to their faith? Never wavered. They're willing to die for it, right? 5 minutes. Let's see what we can do. Verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. That word in verse 8, purposed, he's a teenager, but that word purposed, it means this idea of resolved. It's the Hebrew word sim, S-I-M. It's actually the same word that God used in Zechariah 7:12, where he said, yes, they purposed their hearts like flint, refusing to hear the law and the words of the Lord. So this word literally meant like you had this resolve that you were just not going to change, right? Now, Daniel, it's a good thing, because Daniel says, I'm not eating that stuff, that's all this stuff that's been sacrificed to these false gods, right, before brought in here. Whereas other people, God used that word and said, they just refuse to follow God's word, right? So Daniel and his friends had purposed this. Verse 10, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel basically says, hey, look, just give us vegetables and water, right? And let us not eat this stuff that's coming from the king. And what do you think the master of the eunuchs thinks? What's he afraid is going to happen probably? He's responsible for watching out for these young men, right? And now these young men say, hey, by the way, can we not eat that stuff that the kings and just eat our own little diet over here? And what did we say about the kind of man Nebuchadnezzar was? He was cultured at times, but he also did what? Yeah, he killed this guy's 70 sons before his eyes and then put out his eyes, right? So this is the kind of guy that you wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of, right? And so the master of the eunuchs basically says, hey, look, you're going to endanger my head before the king. Verse 11. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please let your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. So he says, 10 days, give us vegetables and water. Now, I got to be honest with you, that'd be a hard diet for me to go on. But do you think it'd be a pretty good diet for 15-year-old, 16-year-olds? Yeah, I can understand why it wouldn't make them, would be good for them. Look at verse 15. At the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh. Now, I don't think that meant they actually were fatter. Okay, I think it's a Hebrew idiom that means they looked better. Fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. He says, all right, you guys look better anyway. We'll let you keep on this diet. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, about which the king examined, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So we'll end in chapter 1 with that. Most of the stuff in this, there's some chapters where we're going to just do mostly reading through, because most of the stuff's pretty you don't need me to spend 30 minutes explaining to you what 10 times better than others means, right? So we're going to just read through some of these. Now we get into some of the stuff a little more in detail. We're going to look at a lot more. We'll stop going verse by verse. But we'll go ahead and stop there, and about 1 minute early. And if you have any questions, come find me. And if you want my notes, just let me know, and I can get those to you as well. So thanks for your attention, and see you next week.